that's what you need to know for the moment. Deliberately cantering across the arena together, Yvette blows with enthusiasm. She uses her electrically charged body, ears, neck, chest, rib cage, back, and legs to gain insight to my own body. In a rare instant, we are alert to the slightest whisper of a conversation, the shift of a weight, a change of a direction, or the repositioning of a leg. While our communication certainly contains flaws, I like to think that it also holds magnificent possibilities to transcend and create. But even in these moments, Yvette, or Rolls Royette, as her official papers title her, she is still titled as mine. I am called her owner, and there exists a piece of paper which says I paid for her. And from this, I am left feeling guilty for loving someone I own, or owning someone I love. This initial feeling and consideration for a possibility of a relationship cultivated on something more than just this strange feeling of guilt leads me to our discussion today, a Piaffe into politics, considering the reflection of political identity from dressage training and horsemanship. In A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf offers the profound metaphor of women as mirrors in the eyes of men. The looking glass aggrandizes, empowers, and creates a sense of self-assurance in the viewer while simultaneously objectifying, diminishing, and repossessing the embodied mirror. I assert that this exercise of becoming a mirror is not limited to women in relationship to men, but that it is a prevalent process in the gaze that humanity asserts over non-human animals, and thus links the way humans act with and about non-human animals to human political identities. Today I offer the start of a rhetorical analysis of the complete training of the horse and rider in the principles of classical horsemanship by Colonel Aldous Podolsky, the director of the prestigious Spanish riding school in Vienna, Austria, from 1939 to 1965. This artifact is still the definitive text for the Olympic sport of dressage for many riders and trainers today. Specifically, this presentation will work to show that Podolsky's system of horse training and riding is steeped in a Foucaultian worldview through its application of power. Foucault's work most often invokes a discussion of rhetorics of resistance and protest. However, Kendall R. Phillips calls scholars of rhetoric to apply Foucault to discourses of the present. Phillips sees this alternative approach as more faithful to Foucault's body of work and his attempt to illuminate transformative spaces before the instance of dissension, freedom, and thought. These spaces, or gaps, within Foucault's conceptualized nexus of knowledge, power, and subjectivity, create contradictions. Phillips asserts that these contradictions can be seen as compelling the creation of new discourses. And in order to be resolved, these contradictions must be translated and overcome through the invention of new discourses. Kari Wall recently offered training, particularly horseback riding, as a way for the horse and rider to literally and figuratively transform one another, to give the human partner the tools to ask, "Who are you?" and, most importantly, suggested training as translation between species. Training becomes salient to our topic of funny kinds of love because it is so often through training that relationships called love are produced and sustained, as we just heard from our three previous presenters. In his last lectures at the Collège de France, Foucault calls his audience to consider the study of experience and the study of knowledge in a moment that I assert pertains to our investigation today. Foucault shares, "It seems to me that if one really wanted to study the experience as the matrix for the formation of forms of knowledge, one should not analyze the development or progress of particular bodies of knowledge, but rather one should identify the discursive practices which were able to constitute the matrices of possible bodies of knowledge, the forms of verification in these practices." Thus, this project turns not to discourses of animal liberation, but instead to the discursive practices that instruct human behavior around non-human animals or animal training. In my larger project, I assert that insight to the rider, and the larger nature of identities can be gained by evaluating the mechanisms, realities, and implications of instructions on the way humans should interact with non-human animals. Podolsky begins his detailed instructional text with a historical review that establishes his system of training in opposition to a previous normative system. While nostalgic towards the 2,400-year-old Xenophon, the horse trainer of ancient Greece, Podolsky positions his system of training as different than a system developed in the Middle Ages. He laments of Xenophon's training, quote, "His training was based on intuition and kind treatment, a policy that, unfortunately, was not always followed by riding masters in the later years," end quote. He directs the reader to the example of Gristone, circa the 16th century, who, despite study of Xenophon's text, believed in controlling the horse by force, as evidenced by the numerous severe bits he used. From the very first pages of his text, Podolsky's method of working with horses is positioned as different than the normative, often brutal standard. Podolsky produces and records a method of training that acts from and takes into account the gaps that Foucault views as necessary to transformation. Examining Podolsky's text for the spaces of freedom offers only intricate responses. First, the relationship between the horse and rider, as established by Podolsky, is clearly seeped in a language of domination. While not always thematically in front of his detailed examples, Podolsky understands the possibility of the horse and rider at opposite ends. He clearly states, "The rider must always show himself superior to the horse in mental and physical self-control. Submission to his will should not be sought by force, but by his superior intelligence." Using the language of superior, submission, and force clearly establishes this relationship within a complex series of power relations. In a short discussion on punishment, Podolsky insists that they must only be delivered justly and in appropriate doses. He makes clear that if the rider sees it absolutely necessary, quote, as a last resort, end quote, to administer punishment by use of the long whip, a tool which should act only as a driving aid and never to strike the horse, he must do so with unquestioned authority over the horse. Podolsky states, "Its use is the declaration of war, and the trainer should begin this fight only if he is sure of victory. Once he has started the fight, he must carry it through to a successful end." Again, using the language of war, fight, and victory places this association clearly in the middle of power relations. While this cannot be swept aside, this alone does not share the complete picture of the complex relationship that Podolsky hopes for between rider and equine partners. Before addressing punishments and many times following, Podolsky conveys to his reader that the rider must do all he can to aid the horse in understanding. This supports Wells' interpretation of training as translation. In all steps of development, from the first time the horse is bridled to learning new and advanced movements, the rider must work to build confidence in his horse. And the rider must mindfully support and encourage the horse to develop trust in the rider's aids, or cues given through the rider's seat, legs, and hands while under saddle. Podolsky speaks directly to this importance, and I believe his words are important. Quote, "The rider should aid his horse to understand him. This means that the horse should never be afraid of the aids, and that the rider has sufficient patience to be sure his horse understands what is demanded of him. The rider must have an exact understanding of his aids and their effect, and must use them intelligently. He must not allow himself to be influenced by his feelings. To follow this policy must be the constant aim of every good and successful rider." Here Podolsky ties the ability of the rider to be successful and patient patiently translate for his equine partner to a normative value of being good. Thus, the horse's condition, fitness, and beauty serve as a reflection or a mirror of the rider's ability and character. Different than training derived purely from force, Podolsky's discourse changes the space between the gaze of the horse and the rider into something beyond a simple looking glass. In Podolsky's discourse, it is the hope that the horse should seek contact from the rider's hands. And he writes that, quote, "The horse should seek contact from the rider's hands." That is, the horse should take agency in reaching for an elastic feel of the reins between his mouth and the rider's hands. Here the horse also speaks through his movement of his body, just like the rider. Creating a space for this type of agency to arise is central to an analysis of Podolsky's work. Only in creating a conversation that allows and encourages this agency can the rider progress through basic training to advanced movements of his equine partner. Clearly, this quest to create agency and communication does not absolve the rider from declaring war with the long whip, but it does create a moment, a gap, or contradiction between the normatively established position of the rider as the all-powerful sovereign and the horse as a machine or live property. These examples represent a very small portion of Podolsky's text and in many ways fail to address the important themes that are clearly meaningful to Podolsky and his continuing audience. But each example works to show that Foucault's approach to dissension and freedom are not outside the boundaries of horsemanship training texts. To conclude, very quickly, Podolsky also offers his reader advice that works to affect rider behavior beyond the time spent at the stable or in the arena. He asserts, "The horse teaches us self-control, consistency, and the ability to understand what goes on in the mind and feeling of another creature, qualities that are important throughout our lives." I believe this gives us hope, along with Podolsky's system of training, that our relationships with equine partners can be much more than ones of only domination and force. Thank you.